Simple web application with database transaction. In this lesson, we're going to discuss how to create a simple web application with database transaction. Let's develop an application for student information systems where we can enter basic information about students through our application interface to store it into a database. Open a new web application. Now here, we use 3 text box controls for entering number, name, and age respectively. To store these values, we need a database table. We've already discussed how to create a database and table, so then I've created a sample database and a table. Now have a look at this. Okay, go to web form. Let's see how to create connection string and store the values into database table. Double-click the Submit button to go to Code window. Here we are using SQL Data Provider and its objects to perform the transaction. To do this, we have to import SQL Client namespace. Just add the statement to import SQL Client namespace. Go to Button-Click Event. Just add this coding and see the logic. Here, SQL Connection represents the physical connection between the application and the data source. SQL Command Object uses Connection Object to figure out which database to communicate with. In Insert Query, we are assigning text box 1, text box 2, and text box 3 values to number, name, and age respectively. Execute non-query method can be used to execute SQL statement that does not require any data. Press the F5 key to run the application. Now we are in execution mode. Enter the student roll number, name, and age. Press the Submit button. If you want to check whether the data is stored in the database or not, open an SQL Server Enterprise Manager and right-click on the table and open the table. Here you can find that the data which we entered in our application is safely stored in the database table. This is the basic procedure to involve in database transaction. We have different ways to invoke connection between database and our application, and you'll get those techniques in the next level of our training course. About Web.Config file. The ASP.NET Web.Config file is used to define the configuration settings for an ASP.NET application. ASP.NET and the .NET framework use the config files to define all the options of configuration. The Web.Config and other config files are in XML format. We can say that Web.Config file is a replacement for the global.asa for retrieving website setting. Now then, what can be stored in a Web.Config file? Well then, there's a number of important settings that can be stored in the configuration file. And here are some of the most frequently used configurations stored inside Web.Config. They are database connections, session states, and error handling. First off, we'll start discussing database connections. The most important setting stored in Web.Config file is database connection string. The reason for storing database connection string in Web.Config file is that any modification to the database configuration can be maintained at a single location. Otherwise, we'll have to keep it either as a class-level variable in the entire associated source files, or keep it in another class as a public static variable. So, if you store it in the Web.Config file, it can be read and used anywhere in the program. Now then, let's see an example of the connection string which is stored in the Web.Config file. The connection string is referenced by key attributes, and here the key is connection string. The value attribute of the Web.Config file denotes the information about the database. Now then, let's see how to access the connection string from our ASP.NET web application. Here, the connection string contains the information about database connection. In the upcoming lesson, we'll talk about how to maintain session state and error handling in Web.Config file. Maintaining session state in Web.Config file. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to maintain the session state and error handling in configuration file. Let's start with session state. Session in ASP.NET Web application is very important. As we know, HTTP is a stateless protocol, and we need session to keep the state alive. ASP.NET stores sessions in different ways. By default, the session is stored in the ASP.NET process. You can always configure the application so that the session will be stored in Session State Service. There are two main advantages of using the Session State Service, and they are: State Server is not running in the same process as the ASP.NET application. So even if the ASP.NET application crashes, the session will not be destroyed. Also, we can share the state information across the web garden. Now let's see a small example of the session state service. Here, the mode represents the state server, and state connection string is used to locate the state server. SQL connection string is used to specify the database connectivity. Now we'll see how to write code for handling custom errors in Web.Config file. Error handling. It is one of the most important parts of any web application. Each error has to be caught and suitable action has to be taken to resolve that problem. Here is the sample code which has been written in Web.Config file. This tells ASP.NET to display custom error from a remote client or local client and to display a page named errorpage.aspx. The status code 404 displays page not found error. If the custom error mode is turned off, then you will see the ASP.NET default error message. This error message is good for debugging purposes, but should never be exposed to the user. Now then, I hope you've got a clearer picture about Web.Config file and its usage in development of web application. To obtain the enhanced performance, I'd like for you to examine this concept in your application. Binding data to the list box control. Now, what is meant by data binding? Well, data binding is nothing but assigning the values to the properties of the controls dynamically. It has the ability to link data to objects, and it's used to display data from different data sources by using customized layouts. Let's discuss how to store table data into list box control, shall we? Open a new web form. And here we have a list box control, text box control, and radio button list control. In this example, when we select the number option, it has to display all the numbers in list box control from student table. Similarly, if you select name option, it has to display the entire student's name in list box control. And it has to display the particular value in text box control by selecting items from the list box control. Double-click the radio button list control to move to code window. Include SQL client namespace to invoke data access objects. You know how to create a database and how to make a connection to the page. Let's see how to add table data to the list box control. Just add this coding and see the logic. Using the read method of the data reader object, we can obtain a row from the table as a result of the query. If you select a number using radio button list, the control will move to block 1 and execute the statement. In this statement, it will collect all the numbers from the student table and display it in list box control. Otherwise, name of the students are displayed in list box control. Move to list box control, selected index change method, and add this coding. Here we are assigning selected text of list box into text box control. Well then, press F5 to run the application and check the answer. Binding data to the data grid control. We've already discussed about data grid control in Lesson 35. Now let's see how to place a data grid control in our web form and how to connect a database to it and display data in the web form. Open a new web form and click Toolbox. Double-click Data Grid Control and drag it and place it such as this. Click Data Grid and go to Properties window and then click Auto Format link. It will show you the Auto Format window. Select any available scheme which would fit your data grid. Now then click OK. By default, Data Grid Control displays with 3 columns and 5 rows. Click Toolbox and double-click Button Control. Drag it and place it as such. Press the F4 key to get Properties window and change the text property to Show. Double-click Button Control, and we are now in Code window. Here we have to include system.data.sql client namespace. Just add this coding and see the logic. Our first task is to create a connection to database. Use this SQL connection statement. Here we've got to mention the database name, user ID, and password. Next, create a dataset object which will be used for storing and manipulating the data. Here, the dataset object cannot directly interact with database. We need to create a data adapter object which would refer to the connection already created. You can populate the dataset by using the fill command. The first argument of fill method is the dataset name, which we want to populate. The second argument is the name of the data table. The results of the SQL queries pass to data table. In this example, we have created a data table named employee, and the values in this table would be the results of the SQL query select star from EMP. Finally, we have to bind the values to the data grid control using the bind method. Press F5 and you will see the answer. Try to practice this simple example and use your own logic to develop a similar application.